The morning Whitmore Elmswood called me, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing one coffee cup instead of two, and the weight of that small thing nearly brought me to my knees. 3 weeks, 21 days since they brought my husband home in a box. 21 days of learning how to breathe inside a house that still smelled like him, his soap, his boots by the door, his side of the bed untouched since the night before the funeral. I survived the only way I knew how. Moving, cleaning, keeping my hands busy enough that my mind couldn't fully catch up to what had happened. My name is Shirlene Demant. I was 54 years old and newly widowed when Whitmore Elmswood called my house and changed the direction of everything. His voice came through warm and measured, the kind of practiced warmth powerful men learn to wear like expensive cologne. "Shirlene," he said softly, "not Mrs. Demant. Shirlene. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I've been thinking about you ever since the service." I thanked him because that's what grief trains you to do. Accept kindness wherever it appears. He said he'd been reviewing Levon's personnel records, routine matters, administrative cleanup after the accident. Then he told me he'd come across something he believed I needed to see in person. The way he said it made it sound important enough to fear and gentle enough to trust at the same time. "Come by the office tomorrow morning if you can," he said. Then he paused. "And Shirlene, come alone. Don't bring Othel. That boy has always had a temper, and I don't want emotions turning this into something unnecessary." I wish I could tell you I recognized the warning hiding underneath those words. But grief makes ordinary things harder to hear clearly. Whitmore Elmswood had attended Levon's repast, held my hand in both of his, told me my husband was one of the finest men he'd ever employed. So I said yes. Before I go further, I'd genuinely love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. It means more than you think. After the call ended, I stood at the sink staring at nothing for 4 full minutes. I counted them on the kitchen clock without realizing I was counting. Then I walked down the hallway and knocked on Othel's bedroom door. He was sitting at his desk. He turned when I entered and looked at my face carefully without speaking first. That was always his way. Quiet before reaction. I told him about the call, the personnel file, the office meeting, the part about Whitmore wanting me there alone. Then I repeated the comment about him being hot-headed. Something shifted in Othel's expression at that. Not anger, exactly. Recognition. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "You're still going?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once. Then he said quietly, "All right. Just pay attention while you're there." I frowned slightly. "To what?" "To him," Othel said. "Watch what he touches. Watch what he chooses to show you." The words sat strangely with me, though I couldn't explain why. I asked him what he meant. But he only shook his head once and looked back down at the desk like he was thinking through something he hadn't fully said aloud yet. I carried that feeling with me anyway. An hour later, I was backing out of the driveway headed toward downtown Birmingham, toward Whitmore Elmswood's office, toward something waiting inside Levon's file that apparently couldn't be discussed with my son in the room. At the time, I still believed I was driving toward answers. I had no idea I was driving into a lie already in progress. His office smelled like leather and money, and something underneath both of those things that I couldn't name until I was already sitting down. Whitmore Elmswood stood when his assistant showed me in. He came around the desk to shake my hand with both of his, the same practiced warmth he used at the repast, then gestured toward the chair across from him. The desk between us was spotless. One folder on the left, one folder on the right. Nothing else. He sat slowly and folded his hands together. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. "There were some things I felt you deserved to know before certain proceedings begin." Not compensation proceedings. Certain proceedings. Careful language, legal language. At the time, I only noticed that it made my stomach tighten. He opened the folder on the left first and turned it toward me. The photograph inside made my breath catch before I could stop it. Livon sat in a restaurant booth I didn't recognize, across from a woman I had never seen before. Papers lay scattered between them on the table. Her face was partly turned away from the camera. His wasn't. They leaned toward each other closely enough for the image to imply intimacy, if that was what the person showing it wanted implied. And Whitmore Elmswood absolutely did. I felt that cold 3-second movement inside me before reason could catch up. Not belief, not accusation, just the involuntary shock of seeing your dead husband frozen inside a moment you cannot explain. 3 seconds. That was all he got from me. Elmswood watched my face carefully the entire time. Then he spoke in the same soft voice. I struggled with whether to show you this at all. But there are things already under quiet review connected to Livon's conduct on site. If these materials surface later without context, I didn't want you blindsided. He opened the second folder. Inside were copied documents, complaint summaries, internal write-ups, a performance review describing Livon as difficult, emotionally unstable after repeated site disputes, and increasingly resistant to safety directives during the last year of employment. And beneath those pages, a memorandum referencing possible communication between Livon and outside compliance personnel connected to the municipal contract review. Not formal charges, not even an accusation directly. Just enough language to stain a dead man's name without fully saying the thing out loud. It was expertly done. A suggestion instead of a claim. A shadow instead of a statement. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. Every word was a lie. I knew it with the same certainty I knew Livon's hands and his voice, and the sound of his boots crossing our kitchen floor before dawn. But certainty and proof are not the same thing. Elmswood leaned forward slightly. The workers' compensation review may become more complicated if questions about his conduct continue circulating internally. He paused carefully. But I want you to know I'm willing to help however I can, personally. Then his hand moved slowly across the desk toward mine. Not aggressive, worse, gentle. Like a man comforting a widow instead of cornering one. I looked at his hand. Then I looked at him. And in that moment, something inside me shifted hard enough that I felt it physically. Not rage, clarity. I picked up my bag and stood. He started to say my name again, but I turned before he finished it. I walked past his assistant, through the polished lobby, out into the Birmingham morning where the air felt colder than it had an hour earlier. Inside my car, I locked the doors and put both hands on the steering wheel. I did not cry. I had left the photograph sitting on his desk untouched, hadn't picked it up, hadn't asked for it, hadn't given him the satisfaction of watching me carry it out. 3 seconds. That was all Whitmore Elmswood got from me. And somewhere underneath the grief and shock and humiliation beginning to harden into something sharper, something inside me had already started moving. Othel was in the living room when I got home, sitting in the chair by the window the way his father used to sit, back straight, hands loose in his lap, waiting without looking like he was waiting. He looked at my face and didn't ask if I was all right. He already knew I wasn't. I sat on the couch across from him and told him everything. Not in order at first, the way shock comes out, in pieces that don't fit together neatly. I told him about the photograph first because that was the thing still sitting heaviest in my chest. Livon at a restaurant booth. A woman I didn't recognize. The lean of his body toward hers. The way Elmswood watched my face while I looked at it. Othel didn't move, didn't interrupt. He just listened with that same stillness he'd had since he was a boy, taking things in quietly and holding them there. Then I told him about the folders, the disciplinary records, the performance review. 17 years of Levon's work reduced to a problem on paper. I told him about the compensation claim and the way Elmswood talked about it, gentle enough to sound helpful while saying something ugly underneath. And then I told him about the hand across the desk. Something tightened briefly in Othel's jaw. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Did he explain the picture at all? I said no. He just laid it there and watched me look at it. Othel nodded once. Then he asked, "Did he let you take anything with you?" I thought about it. No. The folders stayed on his side of the desk the whole time. Again, that small nod. Then he asked, quieter this time, "Who else was there?" I told him about the assistant, a woman. I didn't know her name. She walked me in and out. Othel leaned back after that and looked down at his hands for a few seconds. Not angry, exactly. Thinking. He got up and made me tea without asking if I wanted any. Set the cup in front of me. Sat back down. We didn't talk much after that. I told him I needed to lie down, and he said, "Go ahead." He'd lock up. I don't know what time I fell asleep, but sometime during the night I woke and noticed the kitchen light still on beneath the crack of my bedroom door. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that Othel was still sitting alone at the kitchen table while the rest of the house stayed dark and quiet around him. Levon's company ID badge was sitting near the fruit bowl, the one they returned with his personal belongings after the collapse. I had moved it around the kitchen 3 different times without knowing why I couldn't put it away. Othel picked it up absent-mindedly. His father's face stared back at him from behind the plastic laminate. Same eyes, same jaw, same calm expression Levon carried even on hard days. The kitchen clock glowed 2:14 in the morning. Othel sat there holding the badge longer than he meant to. Then he lowered his eyes to the company logo printed beneath Levon's picture. And for the first time since the funeral, something about his expression changed. Very slightly. Not grief, exactly. Recognition. He did not put the badge down. She arrived with grocery store flowers and a smile that fit her face the way a costume fits. Convincing from a distance, but strained at the edges up close. I opened the door and Darlette Fentress introduced herself as Whitmore Elmswood's executive assistant. Flowers in one hand, a sealed envelope in the other. She said the office had taken up a collection. Said nobody wanted me worrying about groceries right now. Said Mr. Elmswood sends his regards, and wished he could have come personally. I took the flowers. I took the envelope, and I let her in. I was raised a certain way. You don't stand in your doorway treating kindness like a threat. Not even when grief has made you suspicious of everything. So I led her into the living room and offered coffee or tea. She chose tea. She sat across from me with her hands folded neatly in her lap and her voice lowered into that careful softness people use around widows and hospital rooms. She asked how the insurance paperwork was moving along. Asked whether the funeral home had finalized the billing yet. Asked if I had family staying nearby. A cousin. A sister. Anybody helping me around the house. Every question sounded gentle. Every question was about paperwork, signatures, money. Who was in the house and what arrangements had already been made. I answered the way I was taught to answer polite people. Carefully, completely, without once realizing I was being measured. Then she asked to use the bathroom. I told her upstairs, first door on the left. The kettle had started rattling lightly by then, and while I was in the kitchen, my phone rang. Sister Ardell from church asking whether I still wanted the casserole trays picked up Friday morning. I balanced the phone between my shoulder and ear while turning the burner down and wiping water that had spilled across the stove. By the time I hung up, the kettle was hissing hard enough to fog the kitchen window. I poured the water and set out 2 cups. And only then did I realize how long Darlette had been upstairs. Not alarm long, just noticeable. The kind of noticing you do in a quiet house after loss has sharpened your awareness of every sound inside it. I told myself she was fixing her makeup, freshening up, taking a private moment. What I didn't know then, what I had no reason to know, was that she had walked past the bathroom entirely, down the short hallway, into my bedroom. The closet door stood partly open the way I'd left it earlier that morning. She knew exactly what she was looking for. Whitmore had described it to her carefully. Dark canvas, broken zipper pull. She checked the closet shelf. Behind the hanging coats, near the floorboard by the wall, nothing. She flushed the toilet afterward, ran the sink, then came downstairs wearing the exact same careful smile she'd arrived with. She accepted the tea I handed her and stayed another 12 minutes making small conversation before saying she needed to get back to the office. I walked her to the front door, watched her move down the walkway, unlock her car, fasten her seatbelt with the quick efficiency of somebody already thinking about the next thing. Then she drove away. I stayed standing there holding the edge of the door frame while something cold settled slowly through me. Not fear exactly. Recognition. She had asked about the insurance, the funeral costs, the paperwork, who was staying in the house, but not once, not one single time, had she asked how I was doing, not whether I was sleeping, not whether I was eating, not how a woman survives 3 weeks without the man she built her whole life beside. She asked what I had. She never asked how I was. And standing there in my doorway, staring at the empty street where her car used to be, I understood those were 2 very different kinds of visit. It came on a Tuesday, plain white envelope, state seal in the upper left corner. My name typed across the front with the kind of cold precision that makes you feel processed before you even open it. I almost ignored it. The kitchen counter had become a graveyard of unopened mail. Sympathy cards, utility bills, insurance forms, things I kept promising myself I'd deal with tomorrow. But something about the envelope made me stop. I opened it standing right there at the counter. Alabama Department of Labor. Workers' Compensation Division. The letter was packed with administrative language dense enough to make your eyes slide past the meaning if you weren't careful. I read it once and understood fragments. Read it again, and the shape of it started becoming clearer. By the 3rd time, something cold settled fully into my stomach. Levon's employment classification at the time of the accident had been reviewed and adjusted, following documentation submitted by Elmswood Construction's insurance representatives and legal counsel. Adjusted. That was the word they used. At the bottom of the 2nd page was the new compensation amount. I stared at the number for a long time. It was nowhere near what we'd originally been told to expect after Levon died. A man from Elmswood's HR department had sat in my living room weeks earlier, explaining how straightforward the process would be. He said the company would make sure the family was protected. This number said otherwise. It wasn't just smaller, it was life-changing smaller. The kind of reduction that reaches into every future decision before you've even had time to grieve properly. I set the letter down, picked it back up. Read the 2nd page again, as though the numbers might rearrange themselves if I looked long enough. They didn't. I called Othel. He arrived less than half an hour later. I handed him the letter before he even sat down. He read it standing at first, then slowly lowered himself into the kitchen chair and started again from the top. I watched his face while he read. Othel has always carried emotion quietly, even as a child. But mothers know the difference between silence and restraint. What I saw on his face wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock either. It looked closer to confirmation, like something unpleasant settling into place. He finished reading and laid the papers flat on the table between us. Then he adjusted the corners neatly with 2 fingers, almost absent-mindedly. A small habit Levon used to have whenever he was thinking too hard. When Othel finally looked up, his voice came out calm and level. This wasn't random. That was all he said. Not dramatic, not angry, just certain. I had spent the entire drive home after opening that letter preparing myself for his temper, preparing for shouting, accusations, something explosive. Instead, I got stillness. And somehow, that frightened me more, because anger burns fast. But this felt different. This felt like my son quietly stepping across some internal line he wouldn't easily step back from. Othel left before I woke up on Saturday morning. He didn't say where he was going. He left a cup beside the coffee maker, empty and waiting. The same way Levon used to when he left early and didn't want to. Wake me. I stood there in my robe staring at that cup longer than I should have before finally filling it. I didn't know until later where my son had gone. He drove to the construction site in plain clothes, no notebook, no company logo. Nothing that marked him as anything except a man standing near the place where his father died. The municipal project was still active. Construction doesn't stop for grief. Cranes still moved overhead. Engines still roared. Men still shouted measurements through dust and concrete noise while new steel rose over the exact ground where Levon lost his life. Othel stayed near the outer fence at first, quiet, watching. Eventually, one of the workers noticed him lingering nearby and walked over carefully. Othel introduced himself simply. Levon Demont's son. The man's expression changed immediately. Softened in that automatic way people soften around fresh loss. He said Levon was respected. Said everybody on site knew him. Said the collapse shook people harder than management admitted. Another worker drifted over during the conversation. Older, weathered face, hard hat tucked beneath one arm. This man spoke more cautiously. His eyes moved around the site while he talked, checking who might be nearby before answering anything directly. He mentioned the scaffolding inspection quietly, said the structure had passed review the week before the collapse, said everything looked clean on paper. Othel asked who handled inspections back then. The older worker hesitated, not dramatically, just enough to make clear he was deciding how much he wanted to say. Finally, he shrugged once. Supervisor handled most of it. Othel asked if he was still around. The man looked away toward the far side of the site before answering. He got transferred or put on leave or something after the accident. Nobody really explained it. The younger worker shifted uncomfortably beside him. The older man lowered his voice slightly. People talked about it for a little while. Then folks stopped asking questions. After that, nobody said much. Othel nodded once like he understood exactly what silence on a job site could mean. He thanked both men, shook their hands, walked back toward his car carrying something heavier than answers. He drove home. But when he pulled into the driveway, he didn't go inside right away. He sat in the parked car with the engine off while the neighborhood stayed quiet around him. Through the living room window, he could see the lamp I'd forgotten to turn off the night before. Warm, yellow light spilling across the curtains. Ordinary light. The kind that belongs to houses where nothing terrible has happened. He stayed there several minutes. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. I still don't know who he called, only that when he spoke later about that morning, he said his voice stayed calm the entire conversation. Not cold, not angry, certain. The same certainty I'd heard 2 days earlier when he sat at my kitchen table staring at the compensation letter and quietly said, "This didn't happen by accident." Somewhere beneath all the noise and steel and paperwork tied to that construction site, something had already gone wrong long before the scaffolding failed. And now, something inside my son had started changing too. I had been avoiding that closet for 4 weeks. Not consciously at first. The first week I told myself I simply hadn't needed anything in there. The second week I knew I was lying to myself. But grief allows you certain lies, so I let it stand. By the third week, I understood exactly what I was doing. The smell of him was still alive in that closet. His winter coats, his good suits in their dry cleaning bags, the cedar blocks he replaced every season without being asked. I couldn't open that door without him coming out of it in some form. So I didn't. What finally made me go in was a phone call from Sister Ardell at the church. She was organizing a clothing drive and had I thought about whether Levon had anything to contribute. I told her yes. I told her I'd have something ready by the end of the week. I owed her that much. I owed him that much. Not to let his good shoes sit in the dark forever. I opened the closet on a Sunday afternoon with the bedroom window letting in flat gray light. I moved through it methodically. Shoes on the floor along the left wall. I found his good pair near the back. The dark brown ones he wore to church, and graduations and the one work dinner Elmswood hosted 3 years ago that Levon came home from quieter than usual. I was reaching for them when my hand found the bag. Dark canvas. Pushed back behind the winter coats, flat against the baseboard. I had put it there myself. I remembered it then, the night they brought his things from the site. A man from HR handing me a box and a bag at the front door with his eyes pointed somewhere over my shoulder. I had taken both. I had put the box on the kitchen table and carried the bag upstairs and pushed it behind the coats because I couldn't look at it and I didn't know what else to do with it. 4 weeks. It had been sitting there 4 weeks. I pulled it out and sat on the edge of the bed with it in my lap and stayed there a long time before I opened it. His work gloves were on top. His site badge, a different one from the laminated one on the kitchen counter. A newer one with a barcode strip. A folded rain poncho. A travel pack of aspirin with 2 tablets left. And underneath all of it, a notebook. Small, spiral-bound. The cover bent at one corner the way a notebook gets when it lives in a bag for months. I opened it. Levon's handwriting filled the pages. Columns of numbers, dates, sets of initials I didn't recognize. Entries going back 14 months. I checked the first date and then the last, and counted the distance between them. 14 months of something he had been recording carefully and without my knowledge. I didn't understand what I was looking at. The numbers meant nothing to me. The initials meant nothing. But the handwriting, that particular slant he put on his 7s, the way he printed his capital letters like a man who learned penmanship from someone who meant it. That handwriting was so completely him that I stopped being able to see the page clearly. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the morning they told me he was gone. Not the grief that comes in waves. The grief that comes from understanding that the person you lost was still in the middle of living when they left. When I could see again, I closed the notebook. I put it in my own bag. I smoothed the bedspread where I'd been sitting. I went downstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table and waited for my son to come home. He came through the door at 6:30 and found me exactly where I'd been sitting for the last 2 hours. At the kitchen table, with my bag in the chair beside me and the notebook inside it. My hands were folded together so tightly, my fingers hurt. Othel looked at my face first, then at the bag. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without asking anything. I reached into the bag and placed the notebook carefully on the table between us. He didn't touch it immediately. He stared at it for a second, like he already understood what kind of thing it might be before he even opened it. Then he picked it up. Othel reads quietly, patiently. His eyes moved slowly across the pages. Twice he flipped backward to compare earlier entries. He spent longer studying the columns and numbers than the written notes beside them. Several minutes passed before he finally looked up. First thing he asked was where I'd found it. I told him, behind the winter coats in our bedroom closet, the same place I'd shoved Levon's bag the night they returned his belongings from the site. Othel nodded once. Then he asked whether anybody else had been in that closet since Levon died. I started to say no. Then I remembered Darlette, the flowers, the envelope, the trip upstairs. I told him yes. Something in his expression settled after that. Not anger exactly. Just focus. He asked how long she'd been upstairs. I tried to think back. The kettle boiling. Sister Ardell calling while water spilled across the stove. The silence before I heard footsteps again. Long enough for me to notice, I said quietly. Othel leaned back in his chair and looked down at the notebook again. Then he closed it carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone calmer somehow. This isn't personal writing, he said. It's records. He opened the notebook again and turned it toward me slightly. Dates, material numbers, delivery references, short handwritten notes beside some of the entries. He explained slowly now instead of all at once. Levon had been comparing deliveries against project records, tracking what was supposed to arrive on site against what actually showed up or what didn't. Not every page made sense by itself, but taken together, patterns started forming. 14 months of entries. 14 months of Levon quietly keeping count of something. I stared at my son while he studied the notebook again. How can you tell all that? I asked. He rested his hand lightly against the page. Because I've seen audit files built the same way before. That landed differently than the answers he'd been giving me lately. More real, less guarded. He told me notebooks like this didn't prove anything on their own. Said handwritten logs only mattered if somebody could eventually connect them to invoices, shipment records, inspection reports, or workers willing to confirm what they saw. But this helps, he said quietly. His finger tapped the notebook once. It gives somebody a place to start looking. Not dramatic, not emotional, just honest. The kitchen suddenly felt colder to me. Othel closed the notebook again and slid it carefully back toward himself. Then he looked at me directly. Whatever happens next, calls, letters, visits, act normal. He said it simply. No speeches around it. Just act normal, Mama. I looked at him sitting there with Levon's notebook under his hand and finally asked the question that had been growing in me for days. What exactly did you used to do? The kitchen clock ticked through several seconds before he answered. Then he said quietly, part of my work used to involve reviewing procurement issues tied to public contracts. Used to? Not does. Used to? It still wasn't the whole story. I knew that immediately, but it was the first time my son had opened the door even a little. I asked if he was going to tell me the rest. Othel looked down at the notebook one more time before answering. Not yet, Mama. And something in the way he said it told me that answer wouldn't stay not yet forever. The diner sat on the west side of Birmingham, the kind of place that had been there so long nobody bothered updating anything except the coffee. Booker Arsenault was already in the back booth when Othel arrived. Coffee in front of him, hands around the mug, the posture of a man questioning whether he should have agreed to come at all. Othel slid into the seat across from him and ordered coffee. He waited until the waitress walked away before speaking. I appreciate you meeting me. Booker gave a small shrug. I almost didn't. That was the entire beginning. Booker had worked with Levon for 11 years. Othel found him through a former site worker connected to somebody his cousin knew. Nothing official, Nothing written down. Booker agreed to meet because of Levon, not because he wanted involvement in anything else. For a while, neither man said much. Then, Othell reached into his jacket and placed a photograph on the table. A contractor license photo. Site supervisor. Booker looked down at it and something tightened slightly in his face. "You got that from where?" "Public records," Othell said. Booker leaned back slowly after that. The diner noise filled the silence between them for a few seconds. Finally, Booker spoke. "The morning your father died, something felt off. Not dramatic. Careful." He said the supervisor had stepped away from the crew to take a phone call shortly before the collapse. Said he remembered it because the man usually barked orders non-stop, but got unusually quiet during that call. Then afterward, he moved 2 workers off the north section and reassigned them across the site. Booker stared down at the table when he said the next part. "Your daddy stayed where he was." Othell didn't interrupt him. Booker rubbed his thumb once against the side of the coffee cup. Then he admitted there had already been concerns about the scaffolding earlier that week. Nothing public. Just workers talking among themselves after an inspection crew came through. "I never saw the paperwork myself," Booker said carefully. "But people heard things." Othell nodded once. That was all. No pushing. No rapid-fire questions. After a while, Othell pulled out the second photograph, the restaurant picture. Levon sitting across from the woman. Booker looked at it longer this time. His expression changed slowly. "I think I've seen her before," he said quietly. Othell stayed still. Booker kept staring at the photo. "Your father mentioned meeting somebody downtown a couple times. Said she worked around contracts or a compliance or something like that." He paused. "Said she was asking questions." The diner suddenly felt quieter around them. Booker shook his head once. "I didn't ask details. Around those sites, sometimes knowing less keeps your job safer." Othell said nothing. Booker looked down at the photograph again. "He trusted her, though," he admitted finally. "I remember that much." That landed heavier than everything else. Othell picked both photographs up and slid them back into his jacket. Booker looked at him carefully across the booth. "What happens now?" Othell took a slow drink of coffee before answering. "Nothing happened here today." Booker held his eyes for a moment, then nodded once. Not agreement, exactly. Understanding. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was folding laundry. I had learned in the past several weeks that grief does not pause for tasks. You fold laundry and grieve. You wash dishes and grieve. You stand in the cereal aisle at the grocery store for 4 minutes because Levon had a brand he preferred, and your hand keeps reaching for it. And you grieve. Life continues in its small and relentless ways, and you move through it, carrying everything you carry. So I was folding laundry when my phone lit up with a number I recognized. I set down the shirt in my hands. I looked at the screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered with the voice I had been practicing without knowing I was practicing it. Steady, warm, giving nothing. Shirlene. The same way he always said it, like a man who had known me for years and wanted me to feel that. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." I told him not at all. He said he'd become aware of a letter I'd received from the Workers' Compensation Board. Said he was troubled by it. Said the adjustment had been initiated by the insurance carrier without his direct knowledge, and he was looking into it personally on my behalf. His voice moved through the explanation with the smoothness of a man who has delivered constructed narratives so many times they have become indistinguishable from belief, even to himself. He said it never should have gone out that way. I said I appreciated him telling me that. He said he wanted me to know I wasn't alone in navigating this, that Levon had meant a great deal to him, and by extension, so did I. I said that meant a lot. I kept my voice soft and my sentences short, and I gave him nothing to hold on to. No anger, no suspicion, no crack in the surface he could work his fingers into. I was a grieving widow, grateful for the attention of a powerful man. I performed it the way Othel had told me to perform it, and I performed it without flinching. He said he'd be in touch as things developed. I said I'd look forward to hearing from him. We said goodbye with the mutual warmth of two people who understood each other perfectly and pretended they didn't. I set the phone down on the laundry pile. I sat on the edge of the bed and stayed very still for a moment, the way you stay still after something that required everything you had. Then I picked the phone back up and called Othel. He answered on the second ring. I said, "He called." Othel said, "I know." I paused. I asked him how he knew. He said a contact had flagged Elmswood's number 2 days ago as part of some background monitoring already underway. Said if he called again, I should do exactly what I'd just done. Then he said, "You did exactly right, Mama." I held the phone after we hung up and sat with what I had just done. I had spoken with a man who built a lie around my husband's photograph, who filed paperwork designed to take money from my family, who reached across a desk toward me 6 days after I buried my husband, who may have done far worse than any of that. And I had thanked him, warmly, believably, without a single word out of place. I was not the woman I was 4 weeks ago. That woman would have shaken. This one didn't. They met at a restaurant in Atlanta on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of place busy enough that conversations disappeared naturally into the noise around them. Othel drove down that morning and planned to head back the same night. No overnight bag, no government vehicle. Just 2 former colleagues meeting for lunch in a city that belonged professionally to neither of them anymore. Wesley Pruitt was already seated when Othel arrived. Older by a few years, quiet by nature. The kind of man who listened fully before deciding whether something deserved a response. They had gone through federal training together years earlier and stayed loosely connected afterward in the way some men do, without regular calls or forced maintenance. For the first half of lunch, they talked about ordinary things. Traffic leaving Birmingham, a mutual colleague who transferred west, baseball, nothing important. Then Othel set his fork down and spoke carefully. He described a hypothetical situation involving a municipal construction project tied to federal funding. A worker noticing discrepancies over time, materials billed differently than they appeared on site, inspection records that didn't fully match what crews remembered happening in the field. Wesley listened without interrupting. Othel continued quietly. Suppose the worker tried documenting those inconsistencies himself. Suppose he believed somebody outside the company eventually needed to see them. Wesley leaned back slightly after that. That's a very specific hypothetical. Othel took a drink of water. Neither man smiled. After a moment, Wesley asked whether the worker had ever tried contacting anybody connected to oversight or compliance before he died. Othel said yes. He said the worker believed he was getting close to proving something. That answer seemed to settle something behind Wesley's eyes. He sat quietly for several seconds before speaking again. Then he said, carefully, "If concerns involving federal contracts exist, there are channels designed to handle them. Not a promise, not encouragement exactly. Just a sentence placed very deliberately between 2 people who understood how much could exist underneath ordinary wording. They finished lunch after that. Talked about lighter things on the walk outside. Othel paid the bill. They shook hands in the parking lot and drove in opposite directions. The drive back to Birmingham stretched long and dark in front of him. Othel kept replaying the conversation in his head piece by piece. Not because anything directly happened during that lunch, because of what might happen afterward. He had not filed a report, had not handed over Levon's notebook, had not named Whitmore Elmswood directly. He had lunch with an old colleague and described a situation that resembled one already sitting heavily in his own life. Nothing more. Still, something about it unsettled him. Maybe because his father had trusted proper procedures too. Trusted that if enough evidence existed, eventually somebody would do the right thing with it. And Levon Demont still ended up buried. Othell pulled into the driveway shortly before midnight. He sat in the dark car with the engine off for a while before going inside. His phone rested loosely in his hand. No hidden messages, no calls, nothing waiting for him. Even so, his thumb lingered briefly against the screen before he finally locked the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, telling himself the same thing over and over, that he had only asked questions, nothing more. Darlette had been Whitmore Elmswood's executive assistant for 9 years. In that time, she had learned the precise geography of his moods, when he was performing patience, when he was manufacturing warmth, when the pleasantness was load-bearing and when it was decoration. She had learned to read the difference between the voice he used in meetings and the voice he used when the door was closed, and there was no performance required. She knew which voice he was using when he called her on a Friday morning and told her to go back to the Demont house. He said it the way he said things when they were not requests. No preamble, no softening. He needed her to go back. Look more carefully this time. Upstairs. The bedroom specifically. There was something he needed located. Darlette said she had already looked. He said to look again. 4 words. Delivered with the particular flatness of a man who has never genuinely considered that the person he is speaking to might say no. The flatness of absolute expectation. The flatness of someone who has used a person so long and so completely that the idea of that person having an interior life separate from his needs has simply never occurred to him. Darlette said she understood. She hung up the phone and sat at her desk and looked at the wall in front of her. 9 years. She had answered his calls and managed his calendar and handled his correspondence and done things at the edges of her job description that she had never examined too closely because the salary was good and the position was respectable. And there is a particular way that comfort makes you agree to things you would not otherwise agree to. Slowly, incrementally, each step small enough to feel survivable. She knew what the notebook was. She had heard enough in the past several weeks. Fragments, instructions, the particular urgency beneath Elmswood's controlled exterior, to understand the shape of what she had been moving around without directly touching. A worker was dead. A case was closed. And the man she worked for needed something from that dead man's house badly enough to send her there twice. She was being asked to walk into a grieving woman's home, again, under borrowed warmth and false pretense, to recover evidence of something she had begun to understand was not an accident. She did not go to the Demont house. She picked up her phone and called Shirlene instead. The call was short. She said she'd been thinking about her, asked how she was holding up, said if there was anything she needed, she shouldn't hesitate. Shirlene thanked her and said she was managing and asked how Darlette was doing. And Darlette said fine, just fine, keeping busy. There was a pause near the end of the call where Darlette almost said something else. She could feel it sitting at the back of her throat. The shape of a sentence that would have changed everything. She swallowed it, said to take care of herself, hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after. That evening, I told Othell about the call, described the strange quality of it, the brevity, the pause, the sense of something unsaid hovering over every exchange. Othell listened. He said, "She's scared." Something shifted on his end, and she felt it. I asked if Darlette was in trouble. He looked at me steadily. He said, "That depends entirely on what she decides to do next." Nearly 3 months after Lavon's death, Whitmore Elmswood received the first letter that truly unsettled him. At first glance, it looked like every other piece of administrative correspondence that passed through his office daily. Plain envelope, federal return address, company name typed neatly across the front. But the letterhead inside came from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance. Whitmore read the letter twice before calling his attorney. The language stayed procedural throughout, calm, controlled, requesting documentation connected to a federally funded municipal project and a related fatality review. Nothing openly accusatory. That almost made it worse. The letter requested contract records, inspection files, vendor information, and internal documentation connected to the project over the previous several years. Response requested within 30 days. Whitmore's attorney advised him not to panic. Federal reviews following workplace fatalities weren't unusual on publicly funded projects, especially once labor classifications and procurement questions entered the picture. The attorney told him not to contact employees directly and not to do anything that could later appear reactive. Whitmore agreed. Then he hung up and immediately called the site supervisor anyway. The call went to voicemail. He tried again several minutes later. Same result. The supervisor had become difficult to reach weeks earlier. Officially, he had been placed on indefinite leave after the collapse pending internal review. Then, gradually, communication stopped altogether. Whitmore had convinced himself that distance was safer for everybody involved. Now, for the first time, that distance no longer felt controlled. He sat at his desk, staring at the federal letter while something unfamiliar crept slowly beneath his confidence. Not panic. Movement. The uneasy feeling of realizing something buried may not have stayed buried after all. He didn't know what had triggered the inquiry, didn't know who had spoken, didn't know which thread investigators had started pulling, only that somebody somewhere had started looking closely. And once federal attention settles in the right place, it rarely disappears quickly. I knew none of this then. That same Thursday morning, I was standing at Lavon's grave. The cemetery stayed quiet, the way cemeteries do on weekday mornings. Not peaceful, exactly. Just still. I hadn't brought flowers. Lavon never liked funeral flowers much. Said flowers were for living rooms and porches, not grave sites. So I came empty-handed. I stood there with my hands at my sides and talked to him the way people do when grief finally stops caring whether conversations make sense. I told him I found the notebook. I told him I understood now why he'd seemed distracted during that last year. The late nights, the silences, the way his mind sometimes looked occupied even while he sat beside me at dinner. I told him I finally understood he hadn't been carrying ordinary work stress. He had been carrying fear, and I told him I was sorry for the 3 seconds inside Whitmore Elmswood's office when doubt touched me at all. The sky above Birmingham hung pale and undecided that morning. I stayed there until the words inside me finally ran out. Then I went home and waited for whatever was beginning to move beneath all of us. Darlette kept the document far away from anything connected to Elmswood construction. Not in her apartment, not in her office. Years earlier, after watching one executive quietly blame another employee during an internal audit scare, she opened a small safety deposit box at a local credit union and started keeping copies of certain paperwork there. Not many, just the documents that left a feeling behind after she handled them. The page involving Whitmore Elmswood had been one of those documents. At the time, it looked routine. A contract modification tied to a municipal project from 3 years earlier. Small amendment. Additional subcontractor approval. The kind of paperwork that moved through an office quietly because nobody expected anybody to study it too closely. Whitmore signed it, Darlette witnessed it, and before filing it away, she copied it. Months later, curiosity made her search the subcontractor's name online. The company barely existed. Registration records led through layered filings and forwarding addresses that became harder to follow the deeper she looked. Enough to bother her, not enough yet to fully alarm her. Now, sitting alone with everything happening around Lavon's death, the meaning of that old instinct finally settled into place. Whitmore protected himself first. Always. And if things ever collapsed around him, anybody beneath him would be left there to absorb the damage. On a Tuesday morning, Darlette retrieved the document from the safety deposit box and drove to a coffee shop 2 neighborhoods away from her apartment. Somewhere unfamiliar enough that she wouldn't run into anybody connected to work. She sat in the corner booth, staring at the page for a long time. 9 years working for Whitmore Elmswood. 9 years scheduling meetings, protecting calendars, smoothing over problems, and quietly learning how power behaved when nobody important was watching. And somewhere inside those years sat Lavon Demont, a man who always said good morning, a man who waited for your answer. Darlette searched online for the Federal Compliance Reporting Office tied to public contracts. She read the number twice before dialing. When someone finally answered, Darlette did not give her own name first. She gave the contract number, then the subcontractor name. Then she explained she possessed a copied document tied to a municipal project currently under review. The woman on the line became noticeably quieter after that. She asked whether Darlette could be contacted later. Darlette said yes. The return call came the following afternoon. The conversation stayed calm and brief. Questions about the document. Instructions to preserve it. Instructions not to discuss the call with anybody connected to Elmswood construction. Afterward, Darlette sat in her parked car outside the coffee shop for a long time looking through the windshield. She didn't feel heroic, just tired. Tired in the particular way people get when they've spent years carrying around compromises, small enough to excuse one at a time, until eventually those compromises become heavier than honesty itself. She never called me afterward, never called anyone. What she did, because she finally understood something clearly. If Whitmore Elmswood ever started falling, he would sacrifice everybody around him before he let himself hit the ground alone. That evening, I was standing in my kitchen cooking for the first time since Lavon died. Real food, not church. Casseroles or reheated leftovers from neighbors. Food I chose myself. Food that filled the house with seasoning and heat, and something close to living again. Then the front door opened. Othel stepped inside and stopped in the hallway. I heard the silence before I heard his voice. Then he said quietly, "It's moving, Mama." He stood there another second before repeating it. "It's finally moving." It did not happen the way it happens in films, no courtroom speech, no dramatic confession, no single moment where everything broke open at once. It happened the way most real things happen, slowly, in pieces, over months. The first major development came near the end of winter. Othel called me on a Monday morning and said federal charges had officially been filed against Whitmore Elmswood and 2 company executives connected to the municipal project. Contractor fraud, materials substitution, obstruction tied to a federal compliance inquiry. Elmswood had been processed and released pending trial. His company accounts were under review. Several project records had already been seized. I sat at the kitchen table, listening while my coffee went cold beside me. I said very little. About 6 weeks later, investigators located the site supervisor in another state. By then, the story had already started spreading quietly through contractor circles and local news reports. The supervisor eventually agreed to cooperate after negotiations with federal prosecutors. Not out of guilt, I suspected. Out of fear. The scaffolding collapse was formally reopened after that. Spring came slowly that year. One afternoon in April, I received a letter from the Alabama Department of Labor. The workers' compensation reclassification had been reversed following the investigation findings. The original amount was restored along with accumulated interest during the dispute period. The language in the letter stayed dry and administrative all the way through. But when I reached the final number at the bottom of the page, I sat there crying anyway. Not because it felt like winning, because it felt like correction. Like somebody finally admitting the truth had existed the entire time, whether people honored it or not. The last thing to come mattered more to me than any indictment ever could. It happened almost 7 months after Levon died. Othel called on a Thursday evening while I was folding towels in the laundry room. He told me the Department of Labor had formally corrected Levon's employment file during the review process. Every false disciplinary entry removed. Every fabricated complaint withdrawn. And attached to the corrected record was something investigators uncovered during document recovery. A safety complaint Levon had filed months before the collapse, regarding inspection irregularities tied to the project. Submitted properly, documented correctly, buried internally before it could move forward. I stood there holding one towel against my chest while Othel talked. My husband had done exactly what he was supposed to do. He trusted the system. And the people above him closed ranks around each other instead. I never attended a hearing, never sat in a courtroom. By the time everything reached its final stages, I realized I no longer needed to watch Whitmore Elmswood fall apart to know what he was. The truth had already done that for me. When Othel called later that night and quietly said, "It's done," I thanked him and hung up. Then I walked into the living room. I sat in Levon's chair beside the window, the one with the worn place along the arm where his hand always rested after work. I reached into my bag and took out the notebook. I held it against my chest and sat there in the quiet of a house that had survived something heavy without letting it hollow us out completely. Othel came home about an hour later. He sat across from me without speaking, the same way his father used to sit, present without forcing anything. We stayed there quietly for a long time. Then I finally said, "He saw it. He saw all of it." Othel looked at me steadily. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "He did." Then after a moment he added, "He always did."